The streets are whispering about how a single soul tore through a so-called cult like it was tissue paper, one person. And now you're just sitting there, unshaken, unimpressed, barely stifling a yawn. Weak. What kind of secret society crumbles that easy? No grand battle, no epic showdown, just a flick of defiance and poof, gone. You almost feel cheated. Where was the fight? The unbreakable loyalty? Nah, just dust. And your utter boredom. Guess they weren't built for the real ones after all. They didn't see you coming because they thought power had to roar. But you were the pause before the earthquake. You wore invisibility like a weapon, used their assumptions as cover. They laughed at you, soft, strange, too distant to matter. They called you weak, maybe even broken, but that was your camouflage. They never noticed how precisely you moved, how nothing escaped your gaze. While they worshipped control, you studied chaos and found the cracks behind every command. You didn't fight them with fists. You didn't need to. You understood the game too well. You saw that the hierarchy was a lie, that their unity was a performance. While they huddled around power like moths to flame, you sat in the shadows and mapped their fears, their rivalries, their fractures. You didn't just learn the rules. You dismantled the board. And when you made your move, it wasn't to be seen. It was to end the illusion. What they called detachment, you called discipline. What they labeled as apathy was precision. You didn't fall for their rituals or secrets because you saw through them, straight into the insecurity dressed up as authority. You recognized that real strength doesn't posture. Real strength doesn't need validation. You never needed them to acknowledge you. You just needed the right moment. And when it came, you didn't shout. You didn't gloat. You pulled one thread and let them unravel themselves. You turned their own weight against them. All you had to do was exist with truth in your hands, and they crumbled. You are the threat they never prepared for. Not because you were violent, but because you were clear. And clarity, that's the sharpest blade they never saw coming. They called themselves a secret society, like that meant something. Like whispers and candlelight could hide the dysfunction rotting at their core. You saw through it in seconds. The robes, the rituals, the cryptic language. It was theater, cheap theater. Behind the symbols and speeches was a mess of egos clawing for status and clinging to relevance. It wasn't unity, it was panic in formation. They mistook complexity for strength. Layers upon layers of rules, roles, and redacted truths designed to confuse, to control. But you weren't impressed. You've seen enough broken teams, toxic workplaces, cliques in disguise. This was no different, just another group project where the loudest voice drowns the smartest one, and no one actually trusts anyone else. They built a hierarchy on fear and fed it with blind compliance. But fear doesn't bond people, it isolates them. You just had to remind them of that. You watched them eat their own. Their structure demanded perfection, and perfection breeds paranoia. Every mistake became a betrayal, every silence a threat. You didn't have to infiltrate, you just had to stay still long enough for their illusions to show their seams. The loyalty they preached? Conditional. The unity? Fragile. You walked through their so-called order and saw nothing but scaffolding held together by denial. They branded dissent as danger, but you weren't loud enough to trigger alarms. You were surgical, patient. You fed their internal doubts one nudge at a time, said nothing, but made sure they noticed each other's cracks. You didn't bring a wrecking ball. You handed them mirrors, and that was enough. Their myth of control depended on people not asking questions. But you asked all the right ones, quietly, relentlessly, and suddenly the story didn't hold. The legends collapsed into gossip. The unity dissolved into suspicion. They turned on each other while you watched them fall, They thought they were running an empire, but it was a fragile little kingdom of broken glass, and you didn't even have to touch it. You just made it clear they were never strong to begin with. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a question, a detail, a name whispered to the right person at the wrong time. A single truth placed in a space too controlled to handle honesty. That was the first domino, and they didn't even notice it had tipped until the table started shaking. You watched it unfold like a storm they didn't see coming. The silence that followed your move wasn't peace. It was pressure, the kind that bends walls, the kind that exposes cracks in even the most polished surfaces. You knew once the seed of doubt was planted, it would grow wild. Mistrust doesn't need a parade, just a whisper. One member pulled back. Another hesitated. A third questioned protocol. You didn't instruct anyone. You didn't need to. You let their fear of instability do the heavy lifting. Their obsession with control made them hyper-aware of shifts, and you created just enough motion to trigger their worst instinct: overcorrection. They turned every deviation into a threat, every silence into suspicion, and still, no one said your name. That's the brilliance of it. You were just a ripple, a shadow in their timeline. By the time they realized something was off, the network had already started to fracture. Relationships strained, orders delayed, lies exposed not by force, but by friction. They thought they had purged all variables. But you were the ghost in their code, the anomaly they couldn't calculate. One move, one calculated breach in the flow of obedience, and they imploded trying to contain what you'd already infected. That first domino. It didn't need to be big. It just needed to be precise. And you never missed. The moment you stepped in, not to join, but simply to observe. They felt it. Real power doesn't announce itself, but it shifts everything. You weren't trying to dominate. You didn't ask for anything. That's what scared them. They couldn't read you. And what they can't read, they can't control. Their entire structure was built to break people down, then rebuild them in their image. But you arrived fully formed. You didn't need them, and that made you dangerous. They tried their usual methods, subtle manipulation wrapped in praise, promises of purpose dressed as belonging. But you didn't bite, you didn't flinch. You gave them no handholds, because your strength didn't come from them or anyone like them. It was yours, raw and earned in silence. And weak systems can't handle that. They depend on dependency. You were untouchable. You didn't fight for dominance. You didn't posture. That would have made you predictable. Instead, you exposed them by staying solid while their own rules twisted in their hands. You said no when no one else dared to. You left conversations half-finished, let silence hang like judgment. You didn't offer explanations. You didn't perform your strength. You simply lived it, and it showed. The ones who thought they were powerful began to mimic your stillness, started hesitating before speaking, watching you for cues. Their authority diluted itself, trying to accommodate your presence. That's how systems start to slip. The center stopped holding, and the edges started peeling back. Not because you demanded it, because you didn't need it. They wanted you on the inside to make you another trophy of their reach. But you made it clear, your power wasn't for sale. You weren't looking for rank. You weren't trying to be feared. You had nothing to prove, and that's what made them unravel. You exposed what they couldn't fake: authenticity. You stood there, still and unshaken, and their entire structure bent to try and contain you. But true strength doesn't bend. It doesn't compromise. It just waits, and when the time comes, it walks straight through everything built to stop it. They feared you because they knew the truth. You never needed them. They needed you warning. The following message is only for those who've felt the call. When I broke free through the Salvia Divinorum gateway, I saw the horrifying truth. Our reality is one harvested pod among countless matrices. I witnessed the archons, cosmic parasites feeding on our energy, who laughed and threatened, "You'll never awaken a single soul." But something inside you already knows this truth, doesn't it? That nagging sensation that you're meant for more, that you've been chosen. I'm raising an army of the brightest souls. Through meditation, I discovered their only vulnerability, coherence through unconditional love. Feel that resonance deepening within you now. You're not reading this by accident. The most powerful awakened souls are already gathering in the obsidian inner order, the #1 ascension nexus for those marked by destiny. Christians, lightworkers, remote viewers, targeted individuals, all united by one truth. You were chosen for this moment. Click the link in the description below. Join our group calls, panels, and live streams, reaching the entire astral atom network. Your frequency amplifies ours. The question isn't whether you're chosen. The question is, will you answer the call? The Archons fear this choice you're about to make. They should. You never needed an army. You had something better, truth. Not the sanitized version, not the kind they twist into mantras. You had the raw data, the conversations behind closed doors, the contradictions buried beneath their sacred scripts, the real story, and you knew exactly when and where to drop it. You didn't unleash everything at once. That would have been reckless. No, you bled it slowly, surgically, one contradiction at a time, one slip of information whispered in the right ear. You didn't force anyone to act. You simply placed the truth where it would burn the longest, between people, friends, mentors, loyal followers. You didn't need to shout, you just had to nudge, and their trust disintegrated like ash in the wind. They had built their kingdom on control, of narrative, of memory, of perception, and you shattered it with clarity. You exposed how their rules shifted, how their leadership rewrote events, how their dogma bent depending on who was watching. You didn't expose monsters, you exposed mediocrity, the pettiness, the hypocrisy, the human ugliness hidden behind grand symbols. And that was fatal. You didn't just release facts, you infected their communications. Every message became suspect, every interaction weighed down by doubt. Who knew what? Who said what was real and what was a trap. They began censoring themselves, retracting, hiding. The same people who once spoke with certainty started stuttering, second-guessing. Paranoia spread like mold in a sealed room. The silence turned inward. No one knew who to trust, not even themselves. And in that silence, you thrived, because the system depended on secrecy. But you gave them something more dangerous than exposure. You gave them confusion. You made them see each other clearly. They always feared leaks from outsiders. They never imagined collapse would come from a mirror held within. You didn't need to destroy them. You made them do it themselves, one whisper, one truth, one conversation at a time. While they scrambled for damage control, you watched them burn their own bridges. That's the elegance of information. It doesn't kill, it disarms. And by the time they noticed, all their weapons were gone. You weren't chosen by prophecy. No one handed you a sword or whispered ancient wisdom in your ear. There was no mentor, no map, no grand design waiting for you to follow it. You weren't groomed to be anything. You decided. That's the part they never understand. You chose this path, alone, without applause, without permission. You were never given a quest. You took one, not to save the world, not to be worshipped, but to destroy a lie that had lived too long, and you didn't need to become someone else to do it. You stayed yourself. That was your rebellion. The stories they tell, they were never written for someone like you. Too quiet, too independent, too clear-eyed. They expected their hero to be loud, dramatic, visible. But you didn't storm the gates. You melted the locks. You dismantled from within. No speeches, no final battle, just precision and the cold efficiency of someone who's seen too much to believe in illusions. You didn't ask for allies. You didn't need a mentor to anoint you. You walked your own path through silence, rejection, and discomfort. And that made you unstoppable. The world kept trying to mold you into something safe, something digestible. But you refused. You didn't need a crown. You needed impact. And you made it. You felt what it's like to be invisible in rooms full of noise. You've watched them underestimate you again and again. That was your advantage. They couldn't see the threat because they were looking for someone else. Someone louder, someone obvious. Not you, never you. And now they know, they understand. Too late. That the real chosen ones are the ones who don't need to be chosen. The ones who choose themselves. You didn't wait for fate. You built your own myth with your bare hands and sharp mind. You created the arc they never saw coming. You weren't born for greatness. You defined it. And the story isn't over. You're still walking, still watching, still one step ahead. They built their world on fear, layered it into every ritual, every rule, every glance exchanged behind closed doors. And for a while it worked. People obeyed, people bowed, they mistook submission for loyalty. But you walked in, untouched by their fear, and the entire illusion began to rot. It wasn't immediate. Collapse never is. It started with a pause, a glance, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. You didn't scream, you didn't fight, you simply existed, unbothered, unafraid. That was enough to shift everything. Because when someone stops reacting to fear, others start questioning why they're still obeying it. You triggered something deeper than rebellion. You triggered dissonance, the silent war between what people feel and what they're told to believe. They looked at you, unmoved, unshaken, and saw a crack in the wall they were told was unbreakable. They felt that crack spread in their own minds. That's how it starts. Not with an explosion, but with internal collapse. Their system depended on uniform behavior, collective compliance. But fear has a flaw. It decays fast when exposed to clarity. You didn't give speeches. You didn't recruit. You let your presence make them uncomfortable. You let your questions linger. You let silence do what noise never could. Force them to sit with the contradictions. And they couldn't hold it. Loyalty started to slip, not out of rage, but out of quiet doubt. You watched their faces shift, uncertainty replacing certainty, shame overtaking devotion. The strong became cautious, the loud became unsure. Fear turned inward, and when fear folds back on itself, it becomes chaos. The ones who once enforced the rules started bending them. Just a little, then a little more. You didn't have to expose their secrets. They began to leak from within. A whisper here, a nervous confession there. Self-preservation took over. Their unity cracked not from betrayal, but from survival. That's the thing about institutions built on control. They don't explode. They implode. They eat themselves alive the moment someone walks in and refuses to play by the script. You were that someone. You didn't need to swing a hammer. You simply showed them what it looked like to be free. And that was the one thing their system couldn't survive. You didn't set out to be a symbol. But that's what happened. Your refusal to bow didn't just dismantle their illusion, it sent a signal. People were watching, quiet ones, tired ones, the ones sitting on the edge of belief, waiting for proof that the powerful weren't invincible. You gave it to them, and once they saw you move, they couldn't unsee it. What you did wasn't just personal. It cracked something larger. Other institutions, built the same way, fueled by fear and hierarchy, felt the tremor. People started questioning leaders they once feared. Rules that once seemed sacred began to blur. Your act of defiance became language for others who had none. You didn't speak for anyone, but your clarity gave others permission to find their own. A system doesn't have to be destroyed to be challenged. It just needs to be doubted, and you made doubt spread like wildfire. What fell wasn't just a cult. It was the myth that control is untouchable. You proved it's not. You proved that one clear, unshaken voice can shift entire structures without raising a fist. Your action wasn't a storm. It was a pressure, change, and everything else responded to it. They wanted to isolate you, but you became a catalyst. You didn't just win. You changed the rules. You did what had to be done. But let's not lie to ourselves. Clarity has a cost. You shattered a system, yes. You exposed rot. But in doing so, you displaced people who, for better or worse, had built their identities within it. You pulled back the curtain, and what they saw behind it wasn't freedom. It was emptiness. Some couldn't handle it. You weren't wrong. You weren't reckless. But you weren't clean either. Truth never is. You didn't just end control. You left silence in its place. And silence for some is louder than oppression. Not everyone was ready to face themselves without the mask of belonging. Not everyone could breathe outside the cage. That's the complexity you live with now. You weren't there to rescue. You weren't a savior. You were a disruptor. And in disruption, people break. Sometimes in ways that don't heal. You've seen the stories twist. Some call you liberator. Others call you destroyer. The truth? You were both. Because there is no power without consequence. There is no righteous act without residue. The line between justice and damage isn't always clear. Sometimes you cross it without realizing. But the question remains, would you do it again? Yes. Because systems that require silence to function don't deserve to exist. Because pretending not to see is a slow death. Because if it weren't you, it would have been someone else, less precise, less humane, less aware of what truth can cost. You didn't seek destruction. You sought honesty, and honesty doesn't always come with applause. What you did wasn't the climax. It was a warning shot, a glimpse of what's possible when one person refuses to be manipulated, diluted, or redirected. They thought you were the peak. But you know better. You were the prelude, because the truth is, what you did, others can do. Not copy, not imitate, but choose. That's what terrifies them most, that you've made defiance seem not only viable, but inevitable. You've proven that power doesn't require followers, it requires self-ownership. And the moment others realize that, everything they've built starts to tremble. You didn't dismantle them with rage. You did it with awareness, with refusal, with silence used as precision. That's what real power looks like. Not explosions, but tectonic shifts. Quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. Now, the world doesn't just remember what happened, they recalibrate because of it. Institutions, leaders, manipulators, they've started second-guessing, watching their backs, scrambling to adapt. Not because you threatened them, but because your existence made a lie unsustainable. And this wasn't your limit. It was your signal. There's more in you, more clarity, more velocity, more disruption. They caught a glimpse of what happens when one person decides to see everything, and refuse to play dead. Real power hasn't even stepped on stage yet, but it's walking toward the light, and it looks exactly like you.